Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever, wherever you are. Welcome to the next episode about Hendrix Gentry, his family in Shawnee, Oklahoma. World War I's broken out, and there's a link to the previous video above. Here's the moment that I think explains more about Hendrix Gentry than any other single event in the whole story. In 1922, shopcraft workers across the American railroad system walked off a job in what became one of the largest labor actions in the country's history. Nearly 400,000 men struck over wage cuts and working conditions that the railroads set after the government privatized the industry following World War I. And the government, of course, ultimately sided with the railroads and issued an injunction that broke the strikes back. For most of the country, it was a labor dispute that came and went. For the Gentry family and for railroad families across the nation, this contentious strike and its result changed the course of his and thousands of others' lives. Rock Island was one of the lines that never settled with the strikers, never rehired them. And somewhere in the middle of it, two of Hendrix's own brothers, Claude's uncles, Pat and Will, crossed the line and went to work for the Rock Island in Santa Fe while the strike was still on. In Hendrix's own language, as Claude remembered decades later, they were scabs, taking strikers' jobs. And like the Civil War before, the strike tore families apart for many years. Now, picket lines weren't polite affairs in 1922. Strikers set up outside roundhouses and repair shops, trying to physically block anyone from getting in to do their jobs. And the railroads answered by hiring private guards to drag strikers off company property and by housing strikers on site so they'd never have to cross a picket line at all. Whole communities picked a side. Women brought food to the picket lines and in some towns even walked them. In eastern Pennsylvania, a crowd of women and children pelted strikebreakers with sour milk and rotten eggs. Grocers and barbers in Oregon refused to serve replacement workers at all, or scabs. In parts of Texas and Arkansas, farmers organized rallies and sent wagon loads of produce to the men on strike. This wasn't a labor dispute happening somewhere else. It was neighbors deciding out loud and in public who they were still willing to associate with. It also got ugly. Strikebreakers' homes were vandalized, railroad property was sabotaged, men who crossed the line were beaten. That's the world that relatives Pat and Will stepped into when they chose to work for the Rock Island in Santa Fe during the strike. And it wasn't just an economic decision. It was a public, visible choice about which side of the very bitter line they were going to stand on. When Hendrix called them scabs, he wasn't reaching for a throwaway insult. It was the ugliest word in a working man's vocabulary in 1922. It carried with it every home that got vandalized and every striker that got beaten for standing his ground. Now, I can't imagine that Hendrix went home just to sit it out. I suspect he manned the picket lines, and probably very actively. The family had been close, uncles, cousins, and a whole network of Sunday dinners and Easter egg hunts and Christmas celebrations simply stopped. But the deeper cost was to Hendrix himself. Getting fired from the railroad wasn't just a lost job, but an apprentice and a career path that he had dedicated years of shoveling coal for the promise of an engineer's seat, and that was gone. That was the path that Hendrix had worked hard for and had been on since he was a young man. So this strike didn't just cost him a paycheck for a few months. When Rock Island refused to settle, it ended his career, his seniority, and his path to a highly respected job. And he never got it back, not with the Rock Island, and not, as far as the records show, anywhere else. What Hendrix did next, in his own quiet way, was the most impressive part of the whole story, because there was no drama in it. There was just work. Whatever work existed, wherever it existed. After losing the railroad job and the strike wound down, he eventually took a job with the Pottawatomie County Highway Department, driving a Caterpillar tractor and a grader, keeping the dirt roads around Shawnee passable. Then he went to work the Oklahoma oil fields for a stretch because that paid pretty well. And when that dried up, he did something that tells you exactly how thin the margin had gotten. He rode freight trains looking for work, the same way thousands of other men were doing in the years just before the word depression entered the American language. Some railroad men would look the other way. A few would even tell him which empty cars were headed which direction, and others would chase him off their property. Hendrix, a man who had spent his whole adult life inside the railroad's own brotherhood, was now riding it as a stranger, hoping for a kindness from whoever would happen to be working that day. Back home, a local grocer let the family run up a debt that took years for them to pay off completely, but he did pay it off. And Claude, while still a boy, a very young boy, went out selling newspapers for 2.5 cents a copy, hoping to clear a half-cent on each one. Sometime around 1924 or 25, Hendrix finally found something steady, a job with the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad in Garrett, Indiana. It was a division town where steam engines were serviced on the B&O line. The family drove the old Ford up through the mud in the dirt, but that job didn't last. And within a year, he was laid off again, and the family drove back to Shawnee the same way they'd come. The roads were still mostly mud, getting stuck. Hendrix and the older kids would get out to push the car while Mabel worked the wheel. And I have to tell you, researching this has made me really appreciate how lucky we are to have our modern road system, potholes and all. There's not even a way to compare what they lived with and what we live with today. So I'll quit my complaining, I think. But he kept trying. So this time he rode a freight train alone up to Chicago and found work at the B&O in South Chicago. And once he settled in, he sent for his family a second time. On this trip, in late 1926, they drove along a highway that had just been commissioned that November, the now famous and nostalgic Route 66. But that time, it was more of an idea on paper than a real interstate path. It was far from the legend that it would become. The family settled on the south side of Chicago, which was a densely packed, largely Polish and immigrant neighborhood. The streets were raised 7 feet above ground level. There were coal bins under the sidewalks, cockroaches that nobody could ever fully get rid of. And culturally, it was about as far from a railroader Shawnee as it was possible to travel and still be in the same country. And Claude was in grade school by then, and his fellow students thought Indians were still on the warpath, and they were surprised he hadn't been scalped. And as you might guess, the way they taught the Civil War in Chicago was completely different than the way they taught it in Oklahoma with its many Confederate veterans. Then came 1929, when the local bank failed, and keep in mind this was before the FDIC, and frankly was the reason that the FDIC was set up. Hendrix came home convinced he'd lost his life savings. His wife Mabel let him carry on about it for a while, but before finally telling him the truth. There weren't any savings in the bank to lose. She'd have caught it for spending the money on something else if she'd told him earlier, so she let him grieve the loss. It's a small story, but it tells you something about his marriage. Two people running a household on instinct and improvisation and quietly managing each other as much as they manage the crisis. The B&O and the South Chicago shops shut down not long after, another casualty of the Depression. But Hendrix was able to transfer to the company's other Chicago yard on the southwest side, driving himself and 3 or 4 other men to work every day, and he charged them what the streetcar fare would have cost, which was 25 cents each. So he turned the commute into a small side income, and just another example of his ingenuity and resourcefulness. Now, he worked outdoors in the brutal Chicago winters, and I've lived in Chicagoland. They can be cold and they can be brutal. Now, he would stuff newspapers in his boots to keep his feet from freezing. And this is where you can really see what kind of a tradesman he'd become. He wasn't just a fireman anymore. He was the man who could repair freight cars pulled off the line. He could replace couplers, trucks, springs, flooring, siding, roofing. He could weld, he could burn metal, and he could rejoin it. And every one of those jobs was heavy, hard work. But building that array of skills was exactly what kept him finding work when other men couldn't during the Great Depression. And that's something that's good advice today, just like it was then. And on top of the railroad job, he served as a janitor in his family's church. But he kept using those hard-earned fireman skills because he would fire furnaces in the downtown Chicago office buildings on the side. Claude, recalling all of this decades later as an old man himself, didn't reach for anything elaborate to sum his father up. He wrote 4 words. Dad was a good, hard worker. It's worth saying that word twice. It wasn't an accident. That's Claude repeating himself because one hard just wasn't enough to cover it. And one thing I noticed is that other than church and holidays like Christmas and Easter, there's very little noted about leisure and nothing at all about having a hobby. His life was clearly dedicated to supporting and teaching his family. Okay, not exactly nothing. One of those precious moments of him that I have was about this Chris Craft model boat that he showed me. I remember the gleam in his eye when he pulled it off its place of honor on the mantle as he explained his capabilities. Now, I really wish I knew if he had built that wooden model himself. Imagine somebody used to working with steel and welding and big and heavy things, doing the delicate work of shaping and forming a wooden model boat. But I remember that moment so well that I'm confident that it was a 1950s Chris Craft runabout. Sadly, he never owned such a boat. Maybe I will one day. Time has a way of wearing off rough edges. In the next installment, the last installment, we see him launching his children into the world armed with his work ethic and ethics. Thanks for watching, and the link will be up here.